"We don't need your input." He said it like I wasn't even there, like the words I'd just spoken had evaporated before they reached his ears. His hand came up before I could finish my second sentence, that dismissive wave he'd perfected over the past 8 months. 17 people sat in that room, and not one of them met my eyes. They just waited for him to move on, waited for the meeting to continue, as if I hadn't spoken at all. My notebook sat open in front of me. I'd written 3 bullet points about the partner firm, about the warning signs I'd been tracking for 6 weeks. I closed it. The sound of the cover shutting was the loudest thing in that room. That was meeting number 9. I counted them, you see. Every time he interrupted me, every time he raised that hand, every time he spoke over me like my voice was background noise he needed to tune out. 9 meetings where I'd tried to contribute, and 9 times he'd made it clear my thoughts didn't matter. By meeting 11, I'd stopped trying. Thank you for listening to me tell this. Really, I need you to know that someone hears me now, even if he never did. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know who's out there, who understands what it feels like to be silenced. My name is Leah. I'm 32 years old, and before all of this happened, I was the kind of person who believed hard work spoke for itself. I grew up in a small town where my dad ran a hardware store and my mom kept the books. They taught me that if you did good work, people noticed. They taught me that competence mattered more than noise. I carried that belief with me through college, through my first job, through every late night I spent building models and checking data while other people were out networking at happy hours. I don't like confrontation. Never have. I'm the person who rehearses conversations in the shower, who writes emails and deletes them 3 times before sending. I bite my thumbnail when I'm nervous. I organize my desk when I'm anxious. And I remember details. Small things. The way people phrase sentences when they're hiding something. The exact date someone made a promise they didn't keep. I've always been that way, even as a kid. My mom used to say I had a steel trap for a memory, but it made me too serious. She wanted me to let things go more easily. I never learned how. I started at the firm 4 years before everything fell apart. Junior analyst position, decent salary, good benefits. The company handled logistics consulting for mid-size manufacturers. Nothing glamorous, but stable. Important work that kept supply chains running, kept products moving, kept businesses alive. I was good at it, better than good. I built a forecast model in my first year that identified a supply vulnerability no one else had caught. It saved the company $3 million in the first quarter after implementation. The CEO presented it to the board as something the leadership team had collectively observed. I remember sitting in my cubicle when I heard about it, eating lunch at my desk like I always did, reading the internal memo that praised our strategic leadership for the insight. I told myself it was fine. That's how companies work, right? Ideas flow up, credit spreads wide. I was building my reputation through results, not recognition. I made senior strategist 18 months later, youngest person to reach that level in the firm's history. I had my own office, a small one that overlooked the parking structure, but it was mine. I had a window. I had a door that closed. I thought I was building something real. The CEO's name was Robert, 51 years old, business degree from a respected university, 20 years in the industry. Everyone called him Rob, said it with this familiarity that suggested they'd known him forever. He wore expensive suits, but never the most expensive. He laughed at jokes in meetings, always a beat after everyone else, like he was making sure it was safe to laugh first. In my first 2 years, he'd nod when I spoke. He'd say things like, "Good point," or "Let's explore that." He never said my name when he repeated my ideas to others, but he acknowledged me in the moment. That felt like enough. Things shifted about 8 months before meeting number 11. Small changes at first. He'd check his phone when I presented. He'd interrupt with a different topic before I finished. Then the interruptions got sharper, more dismissive. By month 4, he wasn't even pretending to listen. He'd raise that hand, palm out, and say things like, "Let's keep moving," or "We're getting off track," even when I was directly addressing the agenda item we were discussing. Other people started doing it too. Once he made it acceptable to cut me off, others followed. A senior director named Lauren started talking over me in meetings. A manager named Todd would literally start whispering to the person next to him while I spoke. It was like watching a slow erasure. I'd open my mouth, and people would look away. I started documenting every meeting, every interruption, the date, the topic, who was present, what I'd been trying to say. I didn't know what I'd do with the information. I just knew I needed to remember correctly. Needed proof that I wasn't imagining it, that it was really happening. Meeting number 11 was on a Wednesday. Morning session, full strategy team, plus 2 department heads who usually didn't attend. I'd been tracking something for 7 weeks by then. One of our oldest partner firms, a company we'd worked with for 12 years, was changing. Small shifts in their communication. Their CEO had been named to some big foundation board, the kind of position that changes how people see themselves. They'd started using different language in emails, more formal, more distant. I'd noticed them pulling back from 3 collaborative projects, citing scheduling conflicts each time. I knew what it meant. They were repositioning, getting more selective. We weren't going to be a priority for them anymore, and if we didn't adjust our approach, we'd lose them entirely. That kind of loss would hurt. They represented 18% of our annual revenue. I tried to bring it up in meeting 11, got halfway through my first sentence before Robert raised his hand. "Let's stay focused on real concerns," he said. Then he laughed. Actually laughed. Like the idea of me having insight worth hearing was funny. Someone coughed. Lauren shifted her papers. Todd looked at his phone. I closed my notebook and didn't open it again for the rest of the meeting. I walked back to my office afterward and sat in my chair for 20 minutes, staring at the parking structure. Cars pulling in, cars pulling out, people going about their days like nothing had happened. Like I hadn't just been erased in front of a room full of colleagues who'd let it happen without a word. That night, I went home to my apartment and made tea I didn't drink. I sat on my couch with my laptop and started searching. I pulled up Robert's background file from the company archive, the one from his hiring process years before I'd joined. Standard information, education, experience, references. But I started looking deeper. Old interviews in trade publications, industry conference photos, board member profiles. That's when I found it. An interview Robert gave 8 years ago, right after he'd been hired. The journalist asked who'd influenced his career most. Robert named someone, called him a mentor, the man who believed in him when others hadn't, the man who saw his potential. I looked up the name. Emeritus board member at our firm. He'd stepped down from active chairmanship 5 years ago, but still held a board position, still attended quarterly meetings. I found a photo of them at an industry dinner. Robert looking at this man, with something close to worship in his eyes. I had built my career on noticing things other people missed, on tracking patterns, on understanding how relationships shape decisions. And sitting there on my couch at 11 at night, I realized I'd just found the one relationship that mattered more to Robert than anything else. I didn't have a plan yet, but I had a thread, and I knew how to pull threads carefully, how to see where they led without breaking them too soon. The emeritus board member's name was Frank. I found that in the company directory, along with his assistant's contact information. He kept office hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays, even though he wasn't actively running anything anymore. Old habits, I guessed. Or maybe he just didn't know what else to do with his time. I spent a week crafting the email, deleted it 6 times, started over. I needed a reason to reach out that felt legitimate, that wouldn't raise suspicion. I settled on the company anniversary. We had one coming up in 4 months, and someone in communications had mentioned doing a historical feature. I wrote to his assistant and said I was gathering background on industry partnerships for the anniversary report. Would Frank be willing to share some historical perspective over coffee? His assistant replied within an hour. Frank would be happy to meet. How was Tuesday at 10? I showed up 7 minutes early to a cafe, 2 blocks from headquarters. I'd never been there before. Didn't want to risk running into anyone from work. Frank arrived exactly on time, and the first thing I noticed was how he moved. Steady, unhurried, like someone who'd never had to rush for anyone. He was 73. I'd looked that up. Silver hair, expensive watch that he didn't fuss with, eyes that stayed on your face when you talked. He ordered black coffee and a scone he didn't eat. "Leah," he said, like he'd been saying my name for years. "I've heard good things about your work." I wondered if that was true or just something people said. "Thank you. I appreciate you making time." We talked for 40 minutes that first meeting. I asked about the early days of the firm, about how partnerships were different back then. He told stories about handshake deals and cross-country flights to meet potential clients in person. He asked what I did, and I explained my role simply. Analysis, forecasting, pattern recognition. That's valuable work, he said. Not glamorous, but essential. Most essential things aren't glamorous. I said. He smiled at that. A real one, not the kind people use in business meetings. You're right about that. I didn't mention Robert. Didn't mention being silenced or dismissed or erased. I just listened, asked thoughtful questions, and thanked him for his time. When we parted, he said to reach out if I had more questions. I said I would. I waited 3 weeks before I emailed again. In those 3 weeks, Robert cut me off in 2 more meetings, number 12 and 13, if anyone was counting. And I was, always counting. In meeting 12, I tried to bring up budget reallocation for a project that was bleeding resources. He literally started talking to someone else while I was mid-sentence. Just turned his body away and asked Lauren about her weekend plans. I stopped talking, closed my laptop, no one noticed. Meeting 13 was worse because I'd almost convinced myself it was getting better. I'd prepared a presentation on market trend shifts, spent 8 hours building the deck, checking every data point. Robert let me get through 3 slides before he stood up and said we needed to table this for another time. The meeting wasn't even half over. We just moved on to someone else's update, while my presentation stayed frozen on the screen behind me. I went to the bathroom after and locked myself in a stall. Didn't cry. I'd stopped crying about this months ago. Just stood there breathing slowly, counting tiles on the floor. 11 tiles across, 14 tiles deep, 154 tiles total in that bathroom. Numbers were reliable. Numbers didn't change their mind about you. My second meeting with Frank happened at the same cafe. I'd sent him a question about partnership evolution, about how firms knew when relationships were shifting. He suggested coffee again, and this time, we talked for an hour. I told him I'd been studying how communication patterns changed when partnerships weakened, how language shifted, how timing of responses indicated priority levels. You're looking at behavior, not just contracts, he said. Contracts tell you what people agreed to once, I said. Behavior tells you what they're choosing now. He nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something he'd been thinking. Have you noticed any patterns in our current partnerships? I had. Of course I had. I'd been tracking them for months, but I kept my answer measured. A few interesting shifts. Nothing alarming yet, but worth monitoring. Send me your observations, he said. I'd be curious to see what you're noticing. I sent him a 2-page analysis that night, carefully worded, professional. I focused on 3 partnerships, including the one I'd tried to warn Robert about. I didn't frame it as a warning, just presented the data. Response time increases, language formality changes, meeting cancellation patterns. Let the numbers speak. Frank replied the next morning, this is excellent work. Let's discuss next week. We fell into a rhythm after that. Coffee every 2 to 3 weeks. Always brief, always professional. I never complained about Robert, never mentioned the meetings where I was silenced. I just talked about the work, about patterns and relationships and the small signals that most people missed. Frank asked good questions. He'd referenced something I'd mentioned in a previous conversation. Show me he'd been thinking about it. During our 4th meeting, he told me about his early career, about a boss who'd never listened to him until it was too late. A major client had left because his boss had ignored warning signs. I tried to tell him, Frank said, but some people can't hear until the consequences are already happening. I sipped my coffee and said nothing, but I filed that story away, turned it over in my mind later that night. Frank had learned young what it felt like to be unheard, and he'd clearly never forgotten. Work got worse. Robert started bringing in an outside consultant, a guy named Brian who'd worked with him at his previous company. Brian sat in our meetings now, and Robert asked his opinion on everything. Actually turned to him and said, "What do you think, Brian?" Like Brian's 3 weeks with our company made him more valuable than those of us who'd been there for years. In meeting 16, I tried to correct an error in Brian's analysis. The numbers he'd cited were wrong, not opinion, wrong, mathematically wrong. I said it as gently as I could. I think there might be a calculation error in that projection. Robert didn't even look at me. Brian's methodology is sound. Let's move forward with his recommendation. The wrong numbers went into the quarterly report. I had to watch it happen, knowing it was incorrect, knowing it would create problems down the line. I documented it, added it to my growing file of mistakes and dismissals and erasures. I stopped eating lunch in the break room, stopped joining colleagues for coffee. I came in early, stayed late, and kept my head down. Lauren asked me once if I was okay. I said I was fine. She didn't ask again. At home, I lived in comfortable silence. I had a 1-bedroom apartment with a balcony I never used. I ordered groceries online. I listened to podcasts while I cooked simple meals. I ran 3 miles every morning before work, the same route every day. Predictability felt safe. Control felt necessary. My younger sister called every Sunday. She lived across the country, worked in graphic design, had 2 kids and a husband who coached Little League. She'd ask how work was going, and I'd say fine. She'd tell me about her kids' latest adventures, and I'd listen and ask questions and feel grateful that someone's life was working out the way it should. I didn't tell her what was happening, didn't want her to worry, didn't want to hear advice about standing up for myself or finding a new job. This wasn't about running away. This was about something else. Something I was still figuring out. My 5th meeting with Frank happened on a rainy Tuesday. We sat near the window, watching people hurry past with umbrellas. I mentioned the partner firm again, the one I'd been tracking for months now. Their CEO had just been announced as a new board member for some prestigious foundation. They're positioning themselves differently, I said, more selective about their associations. Frank stirred his coffee slowly. We should be mindful of that relationship. I tried to mention it in strategy meetings, I said. The words came out quieter than I'd intended, but I'm not always heard. He looked at me for a long moment, not with pity, not with surprise, with something like recognition. Send me your full analysis, he said, directly. I did. 3 pages this time. Detailed timeline of communication changes, data on engagement levels, projections of where this was heading, if we didn't adjust our approach. I didn't mention Robert's dismissiveness. I didn't mention meeting 11 or his laughter or the way he'd made me feel small. Just presented the facts. Let them tell their own story. Frank called me 2 days later, not emailed, called. This is important work, he said. I'm going to share it with a few other board members. I want you to know that. Thank you, I said. No, he replied. Thank you for trusting me with this. I hung up and sat very still in my office. My hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, from something else, something that felt like a door opening in a room I'd thought was sealed shut. Meeting 18 happened the following week. Robert was in rare form, joking with Brian, barely glancing at the agenda. When we got to partner updates, he launched into his usual confident assessment. Everything was fine. All relationships were strong. We had nothing to worry about. I didn't say anything, just took notes and watched. 2 weeks passed. I heard through Lauren that Frank had started making calls, asking questions about partner relationships, requesting historical data. Robert didn't seem concerned. Why would he be? Frank was emeritus, a figurehead, someone who showed up to quarterly meetings and voted with whatever the active board recommended. Robert didn't know Frank had been having coffee with me for 3 months, didn't know I'd sent analysis directly to him, didn't know that the man whose approval he'd built his entire career on was watching him differently now. I came in early the morning of the quarterly strategy meeting. It was scheduled for 9, full leadership team plus department heads, standard agenda, budget review, project updates, partner relationship status. I'd stopped preparing presentations, stopped hoping my voice would matter. I brought my notebook and planned to sit quietly, same as always. I got coffee from the break room and walked back toward the meeting space. That's when I saw Frank in the lobby, just standing there in his coat, talking to someone from facilities. My heart kicked hard against my ribs. He wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't a board meeting. This was internal strategy. Frank didn't attend these. He saw me and nodded. Nothing more, just a simple acknowledgement. I nodded back and kept walking. The meeting room filled up. Robert arrived last, laughing with Brian about something. He didn't notice Frank sitting in the back corner. None of them did. They were too busy settling in, opening laptops, pouring water from the pitchers on the side table. Robert called the meeting to order. We moved through budget items, discussed project timelines. Everything normal, everything routine. Then we hit partner relationships. Robert stood up. He loved standing when he presented, liked the authority it gave him. Our partnerships remain strong, he started. In fact, I'd say we're in the best position we've been in years. He pulled up a slide showing our top 5 partners. The firm I'd been tracking was listed second. Robert pointed at their logo and smiled. This one's been particularly solid. Their CEO calls me personally to check in. They're desperate to maintain our relationship. A few people chuckled. Robert fed off it, got more animated. Honestly, they'll take whatever terms we offer at this point. They need us more than we need them. He changed his voice then. made it higher, mocking. An imitation of their CEO. Whatever works for you, Robert. We're flexible, Robert. More laughter. Lauren was grinning. Brian nodded along, like this was brilliant business strategy. I felt sick, not because Robert was being cruel, though he was, but because he was doing it in front of the one person whose opinion actually mattered to him, and he didn't even know it yet. Frank cleared his throat, not loud, just enough. Robert stopped mid-sentence, turned, saw Frank sitting there in the back corner, hands folded on the table in front of him. The color drained from Robert's face so fast I could track it happening, pink to white in 3 seconds. Frank, Robert said. His voice had gone thin. I didn't realize you'd be joining us. I wanted to observe, Frank said quietly. His tone was neutral, calm, the kind of calm that made you nervous. Please continue. Robert tried to laugh. I was just explaining our strong partner relationships. Yes, Frank said. I heard. You mentioned that firm whose CEO is desperate for your business, the one you were mimicking. It was just a joke, Robert said quickly. We have a great relationship with them. Frank leaned back slightly in his chair. That's interesting, because their CEO is on the foundation board, the same one I joined last year. We had dinner together, 8 days ago. The room went absolutely silent. Not the kind of silence where people were waiting for more information. The kind where everyone suddenly understood something terrible was happening and didn't know where to look. Robert's mouth opened. Nothing came out. He mentioned something during our conversation, Frank continued. His voice stayed quiet, steady. Said he'd been considering reducing commitments with certain partners. Wanted to focus on relationships built on mutual respect and aligned values. Robert's hands gripped the back of the chair in front of him. Frank, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I don't think so. Frank stood up slowly. I received an analysis last month, very thorough. It detailed exactly the kind of communication shift that indicates a partnership in decline. Response delays, language changes, engagement reduction. The analyst predicted we'd lose this partner within 6 months if we didn't adjust our approach. He paused. Instead of adjusting, you mocked them in a room full of people. Robert looked around frantically. His eyes landed on me. Really looked at me for the first time in months. I saw the exact moment he understood, saw recognition flood his face, followed immediately by something that looked like betrayal, like I'd done something wrong by not letting him silence me forever. I held his gaze, didn't smile, didn't need to, just looked back at him with all the calm I'd been building for months. I'd like to see the full partner relationship analysis, Frank said, the one I received. I think the board needs to discuss this at the next meeting. He walked toward the door, then paused. The analysis was excellent work. Exactly the kind of strategic thinking this firm should be listening to. He left. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Robert stood frozen at the front of the room. Brian stared at his laptop. Lauren suddenly found her phone fascinating. No one spoke. No one moved. I gathered my notebook and stood up. Walked out of that room, with my head up and my hands steady. Behind me, I heard Robert say something about taking a short break. His voice shook. The board met the next day. I wasn't there, but I heard about it afterward. Frank called an emergency session, invited 3 other board members, made some phone calls that morning, including one to the partner firm's CEO, asked direct questions about their relationship with our firm, about their future plans, about their perception of our leadership. The partner CEO was honest, said they'd been considering ending the partnership, said they'd felt increasingly disrespected, said Robert's approach had become problematic. Frank presented my analysis, showed the board exactly what they'd been missing, what Robert had dismissed as unimportant, what he'd laughed at in meeting 11 while I sat there and absorbed the humiliation. 62 hours after Frank walked out of that strategy meeting, Robert submitted his resignation. The official statement went out that afternoon, pursuing other opportunities, grateful for his time with the firm, wishing everyone continued success. I read it at my desk, let the words settle, didn't feel triumphant, didn't feel vindicated, just felt tired, and maybe a little bit free. Robert cleaned out his office the next morning. I watched from my window as he carried a box to his car. He didn't look back at the building, just loaded his box, got in, and drove away. The man who'd built his career on Frank's belief in him had shown Frank exactly who he'd become, someone who couldn't hear warnings, someone who dismissed the people trying to help him, someone who mocked relationships that mattered until those relationships destroyed him. The firm brought in an interim CEO while they searched for permanent replacement. First strategy meeting after Robert left, I mentioned a forecast adjustment we needed to make. Opened my laptop, pulled up my analysis. The room went quiet, but different this time. Not the silence of people waiting for me to stop talking, the silence of people actually listening, really hearing what I had to say. Lauren asked a follow-up question. A good one. Brian took notes. The interim CEO nodded and said, "Let's make that adjustment. Can you send the full analysis to the team?" "Yes," I said. I never got Robert's job. Didn't want it. I'm still a senior strategist. Still in my office overlooking the parking structure. Still doing the work I've always done. But now when I speak, people listen. Now when I share analysis, it gets read. Now when I walk into meetings, I don't have to brace myself for erasure. Frank and I still have coffee sometimes. Less frequently now. We don't need the pretense of business discussions anymore. Last time we met, he asked how I was doing. Really asked, like he cared about the answer. Better, I told him. I'm doing better. He smiled. Good. You should be heard. Your work matters. If you stayed with me until now, thank you. Really. Thank you for listening to what he never would. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. Would you have stayed quiet? Would you have fought differently? And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about what happens when people finally stop accepting silence, you know what to do. I'll be here, telling the truth about what it takes to be heard.